in the wilds of late 19th century America, where the wind carries dust, and hope is sometimes as fragile as a candle before a storm, a woman leaves the East, carrying a letter and a dream of a peaceful home. She is Evelyn Hart, a mail-order bride who believes she is about to find a good husband in a land called Dust Creek Hollow. But when the train stopped, there was no one waiting, only a 10-year-old boy, barefoot, with wind-burned eyes, said softly, "Pa died 2 days ago. Snake bite." From that moment on, Evelyn's life took a different turn. No husband, just 7 hungry and scared children in a rotten house in the middle of the wilderness, and the woman, instead of turning away, chose to stay. Day after day, she lit the fire, taught the children to laugh, taught them to live, and then learned to love them as her own flesh and blood. If it were you, in a strange land, alone, without a husband, with only strange children calling your name, would you stay? This is a story of a woman who not only survived, but healed an entire family, a journey that proves family is not born, it is chosen. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join me in the touching story. Mail-order bride arrived to find 7 children and no husband, but she became the mother they wished for. The West train rocked along the dry, dusty tracks, its iron wheels screeching like metal scraping against memory. In the cramped third-class compartment, Evelyn Hart sat by the window, clutching a crumpled letter, the envelope already stained with fingerprints. She read it for the 10th time or more. Each time the train lurched around a curve, as if the words might change meaning if read long enough. My little farm is at the foot of Dust Creek, with a chicken coop, a sturdy house, and plenty of shade in the summer. I don't ask much, except for someone who can keep a kitchen and a heart. I'm a gentle man. Not much talk, but I promise you I won't let you want Samuel Reed. That promise, simple, clumsy, was Evelyn's only thread to the future. Back east, she had nothing left but an empty rented room and hands calloused from sewing. They said the West needed women, mail-order wives. Some were lucky, some weren't. At least Samuel Reed knew how to write truthfully. Evelyn thought. On the ship, everyone had a reason to leave: debtors, widows, wounded soldiers, orphans with foster parents. As for her, she only brought a letter and an oak suitcase engraved with the letters E.H. The train whistled, steam billowing through the cracks in the door, carrying the smell of coal and metal. She closed her eyes, picturing a small house in the meadow, with a gentle man waiting on the porch. A solid house, she repeated, chickens, a gentle husband. But when the train stopped at Ash Hollow Depot, there was no one waiting. The station was just a hard ground, with a tilted wooden board bearing a few faded letters. Dust flew everywhere, and the dry wind tore through the cactus bushes. There was no sign of the man in the old felt hat she had imagined. Only a boy, about 10 years old, skinny and barefoot, standing a few steps away, holding a tattered hat in his hand. Miss Hart. Her voice was hoarse and a little shaky, as if she was not used to speaking to adults. Evelyn nodded, her heart suddenly lightening. His boy, she thought, and he must be on his way. But the child looked down, his small shoulders slightly hunched. Pa died 2 days ago. Died, she repeated softly, her voice fading with the wind. Snake. Needless to say, in this region, venomous snakes kill faster than sadness. There was a long silence, as if all the air had been sucked out of the station. The train behind her whistled and started to move. Evelyn turned around and watched the cars leave, slowly, then faster and faster, until they were just a trail of white smoke dissolving into the pale blue sky. That was the moment she knew there was no going back. The boy was still standing there, barefoot on the gravel, his eyes bright and dry. "There's 6 of us now," he said, his voice as small as the wind through the fence. "There used to be 7. Evelyn asked no more questions. In the slanting sunlight, the boy's face was tanned, his small hands calloused, his nails caked with dry dirt, the image of a child no longer allowed to be a child. She tightened the strap of her suitcase and looked down at it. "Where's the house?" The boy pointed northwest, where the Dust Creek hills rose like brown scars. This way, they walked. The dirt path led through wormwood and cactus, across the dry stream channel. The sun was a glaring eye on every step. The smell of dust mixed with the smell of sweat and old ash. No one spoke, Evelyn thought. Perhaps she would return to Ash Hollow tomorrow, if there was another train. But then she looked at the boy, the small figure still walking ahead, head bowed, walking steadily. The thought vanished like smoke. On the way, they passed a wooden cross stuck in the ground, where the ground was still fresh. The boy stopped. "That's Pa." She stood still, not because she was afraid, but because there was something in the air that made people afraid to speak. There are graves that seem to speak more clearly than the living, she thought. They tell us that this life waits for no one. They continued on. As the shadows of the mountains lengthened, Evelyn saw a ramshackle wooden house, leaning to one side as if against the wind. The chimney was cracked, the roof patched, the door frame hung crooked. A rusty bucket lay on the porch, lightly hitting a pillar and rattling in the wind. From inside, a few small faces peered through the windows, curious, alert, hungry. The smell of boiled beans wafted out, mixed with the fumes of ash. Evelyn stood still, her eyes fixed on the empty doorway where a man would have come to greet her. There was no one there, only the boy, standing beside him, his small hand still clutching his hat. "We waited," it said softly. "Pa said you'd come." In Evelyn's mind, Samuel Reed's letter appeared. The handwriting as clumsy as the first strokes of a plow. "I promise. I will not leave you wanting." A man was dead, but his promise was still there, handwritten, clear, like a contract between the living and the dead. She climbed the porch steps, the wood creaking under her feet. In the distance, the sun was setting behind the mountains, a red streak of light like cooling ashes. The door opened, and 6 pairs of eyes looked at her. No one said a word. In that silence, Evelyn Hart put down her suitcase, brushed her hands off, and asked calmly, "Where's the kitchen?" The boy nodded and led the way. That was the first answer. And also a new promise, not written on paper, but carved into the wind, into the dust, into the heartbeats of those who had never been waited for. I don't know if I crossed that threshold out of compassion or fear of emptiness. But from that moment on, the way back was closed behind me. The Reed house was not in the middle of the prairie, but half swallowed by it. The roof tilted to the west wind, the wood cracked like dry leather. The chimney cast a slanted shadow on the ground. If Samuel Reed's spirit were around, he would still be trying to keep it from collapsing as if he were holding on to the last thing he had. Stepping through the doorway, Evelyn felt a chill unlike anything outside. The faint smell of boiled beans wafted up, melting into the damp smoke, and in the coppery light 6 small faces looked up. No voices, no greetings, only the heavy silence of a place accustomed to waiting and no one returning. Luke stood near the door, his eyes watching the strange woman's every move like a small animal, not yet knowing whether to fear or trust her. At the corner of the table, Grace, her hair in 2 braids, held a wooden spoon like a weapon. When Evelyn approached, she said, "I stir things. Mama used to." It spoke with the firmness of a child who had learned to protect others. Evelyn did not answer. She looked around and saw Thomas, Levi, and Jonah sitting close together, 3 small, thin boys with torn shirts, bare feet, and wide, unblinking eyes. In a wooden box near the stove lay a newborn baby, breathing weakly, its skin pale. The dining table had only 5 chairs, 1 empty. Evelyn understood without asking. "That was Pa's," Luke said softly, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. She nodded, then it stays empty. A gust of wind whistled through the cracks in the wall, causing the fire in the kitchen to waver. Evelyn bent over the suitcase and unlocked the wooden door. Inside were all her possessions, a handful of dry flour, a packet of salted meat, a few sprigs of dried herbs wrapped in a cloth. They were pitifully small things, but the beginning of something greater than hunger. She rekindled the fire, added some water, and added the salted meat. A bubbling sound filled the air, accustomed only to the sound of wind. The scent of herbs wafted in, light but different from the bland smell of beans. The children watched. Grace stood near the stove, still holding the spoon, then slowly relaxed. In that house, I understood one thing. The voice seemed to echo from many years later that those children were not waiting for a miracle, just waiting for someone to make the meal smell of life. The soup boiled long enough to become thicker than tears. Evelyn divided out portions for each child, starting with the smallest. The bowls were chipped, the wooden spoons worn. When everyone had a hand, she spoke slowly, clearly. "Eat slowly. Let your bellies remember." The children looked at each other and began to eat, timidly, without speaking or laughing. But amid the clink of spoons and bowls, something was changing, very slightly, like a small stream finding its way through dry land. When the children finished eating, Evelyn sat quietly, her hands in her lap. Her portion was still in the pot, but she did not touch it. Luke noticed. "Aren't you hungry?" he asked, his voice testing. She smiled slightly. "You eat first, mothers eat last." The words made the air freeze for a moment. Grace looked up, her eyes sparkling with something she couldn't name. Then she bent down and continued stirring her cup. Outside, the sun had set. Pale orange light filtered through the cracks in the walls, illuminating each child's face, a light as warm as a human hand. Evelyn gathered up the empty bowls, rinsed them, and hung them to dry on the shelves. Each movement was slow and sure, as if the house had been hers for a long time. Luke watched it all, not missing a thing. When she stepped out onto the porch, he followed. "You'll stay tonight." Evelyn looked toward Dust Creek, where the hills were purple in the sunset. Yes, just one word. But in that silence it sounded like an oath. Night fell quickly, and the wind blew through the cracks in the roof, shaking the wooden boards. Evelyn added more wood to the fire, and the smoke stung her eyes. In the firelight, she saw her own shadow against the wall, no longer a stranger, but someone who belonged here. At that time, I didn't know that just one meal could be a promise, but the children understood. They understood by their silence, by their eyes following my every movement of my hand. And I understood by not eating, so that they could be full first. In the darkness, the house seemed to breathe, smoke, crackling wood, wind against the walls. There was no crying, no praying, but there was a strange feeling, as if the old spirits were leaving peacefully, when everyone was asleep. Evelyn sat by the stove, watching the fire die down. Outside, the prairie was black, save for the low moon. She gently placed her hand on her chest, feeling her heartbeat match the rhythm of the house, weak, but still alive. Perhaps that was the first time I was no longer afraid. The first morning in Dust Creek Hollow came in silence. The wind crept through the cracks in the walls, blowing ashes from the cold stove onto the ground. Pale dawn light filtered through the cracks in the door and caught Evelyn Hart's hair as she opened her eyes. The house was silent except for the soft breathing of the children. She sat up, wrapping her hand in a blanket, her hands shaking slightly from the cold. For a brief moment, Evelyn thought of Ash Hollow Depot, the afternoon train, the iron whistle, the cars that would take them far away. The thought was fleeting and gone. Here, there was no one to help her tend the fire. The door opened softly. Luke Reed, the eldest, entered, his arms full of small bundles of firewood, his cheeks red from the morning wind. He put the firewood down on the floor and looked at her, his ashen eyes filled with a question he was not yet old enough to ask. "Are you staying today, too?" Evelyn did not answer at once. She bent down, restacked the wood, then leaned over the stove and lit a fire with the steel rod. The sparks smoked, glowing faintly in the mist of the house. "That's how I answer." A voice echoed from a distant memory with actions, not words. She added wood, heated the water, then lifted Abigail, the youngest, out of the barrel and wrapped her in a blanket. The baby opened her eyes, looked around, and then fell back asleep, breathing evenly. Grace came over, her hair tousled, still holding the wooden spoon. "We only have cornmeal left," she said. "Then that's what we'll make." She taught them how to make pancakes. The cornmeal was sifted, the water poured slowly, and the hands mixed. Each child had a job. Thomas stirred. Levi tended the fire. Jonas cracked the eggs left in the basket. Their hands were small, clumsy, but attentive. Evelyn stood in the middle of the kitchen, feeling a small life form from the ashes. Their rations were ground corn, beans, and sometimes meat if someone stopped by. Evelyn listened to Luke, his voice even, uncomplaining. It wasn't poverty, it was the normality of this land. But as she looked at the golden pancake pan, heard the crackle of hot fat, she knew that normality could be made again more durable, more warm. The smell of cornbread filled the house, mingling with the smell of smoke and the morning light. Grace laughed when Jonas dropped an egg. Levi laughed along. Thomas tried to hide it, but the corners of his mouth curved up too. Laughter rang out for the first time in that house, not loud, not crisp, just like the wind blowing through the meadow, but enough to change the atmosphere. Evelyn looked at the children and saw something in their eyes that was both strange and familiar. Not faith, but hope learning to walk again. When the cake was done, she divided it evenly. 6 portions for the children and a small portion for herself. They sat around the table, the empty chair still there. No one dared to sit. Luke held the cake and looked at her. "It smells like real food." She smiled and said nothing. When everyone was almost done eating, Luke tore his cake in half and placed one half on her plate. "For you." Evelyn started to refuse, but the boy's eyes stopped her. She took it, taking a small bite. The bread was crumbly, lacking enough salt, but the warm taste stirred something in her heart. At that moment, the voice returned, low and slow. I knew that the child had opened the first door, not the door of the house, but the door of the heart. Evelyn worked tirelessly all day. She mended the torn curtain, carefully wrapped up the remaining flour, swept the floor. Each small task, repeated over and over again, was like a thread connecting her to this place. As the sun set, she went out onto the porch and stood looking out at the distant hills. The wind blew up from Dust Creek, carrying the scent of dry grass and damp earth. She looked down at her hands, rough, powdery, and smelling of smoke. No one was there to tell her whether to stay or go. No promises, no more letters. Inside, the children were clearing the dishes, their voices calling, crashing, murmuring like the first song after a long funeral. Evelyn took a deep breath. In the sky, a lost migratory bird cried alone, then disappeared into the clouds. "I don't know how," she thought, "but I won't leave." The words were not spoken aloud. They lay in the breath, in the wind and the ash, like a seed newly buried in the earth. And Dust Creek Hollow, that barren land, moved slightly, as if listening too. Night came. Evelyn rekindled the fire. The flickering light fell on the sleeping children's faces, and the shadows on the wall swayed dreamily. She sat there for a long time, watching the fire burn down, her eyes never leaving the last ember. That was the first night. The narrator's voice echoed softly, when a woman ceased to be a passerby and became part of the family. That afternoon, the sky was ashen. The clouds were gathering in the east, heavy and low, threatening to swallow the prairie. Evelyn Hart was drying linen by the fence when Luke Reed called Miss Evelyn. "Look." The boy's voice was hoarse, full of caution. She looked up, on the horizon, where there were no settler houses. A thin column of smoke rose not high, not thick, but steady, like the breath of someone burning something just to be seen. In Dust Creek, smoke always meant something. It spelled good news or disaster. I didn't say anything at the time. The narrator's voice echoed slowly in memory, but my heart knew. Something out there was watching us. She watched the smoke for a long time, until the west wind picked up and carried it away. Luke was still standing beside her, his hands gripping the shovel. His eyes were no longer those of a child. Night came. The moon was pale. The wind whistled through the roof. The open windows creaked. Evelyn made the children sit near the fireplace. Around the fire, the firelight illuminated the small faces that listened, not fully understanding what threatened them. Grace hugged Abigail and asked softly, "It's just wind, right?" Evelyn nodded, "Just wind." But Luke understood better. He pulled back the shutters, set the rusty gun by the door, and sat with his knees up, his eyes fixed on the dark porch. The firelight shone on his cheeks, highlighting the hard bones. For the first time, he looked like a man of the house, outside. The dry grass rustled, then fell silent. The wind died down. The house held its breath. Evelyn sensed a different kind of silence, heavier, thicker, the kind that only happened when someone was looking in from outside. She rose and went to the window. In the midst of the moonlit hills, a horseman appeared on the horizon, motionless, a black figure on silver, his cap pulled low, his horse motionless. He neither approached nor turned away. Just stand and look down. Eyes cannot see, but can feel. I understood then. The narrator's voice dropped. In this land, there are people who don't need to enter a house to strike fear. They just stand there and look. Evelyn closed the curtain gently, saying nothing. She turned back and said to Luke, "Keep the fire up. Don't let it die tonight." It nodded, not asking why. The night was long. Outside, the horse neighed softly once and then fell silent. Inside, the fire burned until dawn. When dawn came, the clouds parted and the hill was empty. Evelyn went outside, her eyes stinging from lack of sleep. The ground was damp, with strange boot prints around the chicken coop. The coop door was open. The 2 hens were gone. Only white feathers stained with blood lay on the ground. She stood there looking for a long time, not speaking. Luke stepped back, silent. "Fox?" he asked. Evelyn shook her head. "Men." The shoe print was large, the toe pointing straight home, then turned away. No other words were needed. The warning was as clear as scripture. She did not leave the house all day. The doors were bolted, the cracks covered. Luke helped to nail them with iron nails. The children were assigned to gather firewood, but not beyond the yard. Evelyn did not let anyone out of her sight. In the afternoon, she took a hammer and fixed the door hinge. The sound of the hammer echoed evenly and dryly, echoing off the hill. Each knock was like an answer sent into the void. "I know you are there, but I will not leave home." As the evening wore on, she told the children stories, not fairy tales, but stories of people going west to start over, of log houses that kept warm through the long winter because someone inside refused to leave. "Grace Hoy, did they stay, Evelyn, Jap?" "They stayed." She spoke slowly, without looking at anyone, as if talking to herself. Outside, dusk fell over Dust Creek. Luke looked out the window. No smoke, no people, just a windless expanse of grass. But he kept the gun at his side, his finger on the trigger, not out of fear, but because he knew it was time to defend this place. Evelyn stood behind, watching his back, then gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "It's all right. We keep the fire burning. That's enough." The fire in the kitchen flickered, its red light reflecting on the walls. On her face, the woman who once only wanted a roof over her head, now became the fire that kept the whole house from going out. Later, whenever I thought back, the narrator's voice returned, light as the wind. I could still see the shadow of the horseman on the hill. He never came down, but he made me know where I belonged. When someone wants to chase you away, and you still stand there, that's when you truly have a home. Outside, the moon rose. The shadows on the hills were long as ink blots. Inside, 6 children slept soundly around the fire, and Evelyn sat by the door, her hammer still at hand. No more smoke, no more people, only the sound of the wind blowing across the prairie and the will of a western woman, quiet as the land itself, but strong as old oak. 2 days after the henhouse was destroyed, Dust Creek was as still as if the wind were afraid to blow. Evelyn rose early, boiled water, heard the crackling of wood in the stove. The smell of smoke mixed with the mist. The children were still asleep, huddled around the stove like 6 small pieces of coal that still held the warmth of the night. The house needed cleaning. Dust clung to every corner, and the floorboards squeaked underfoot like sighs. Evelyn had no specific plan, only that if her hands were busy, her mind would wander less. She gathered up old things, cleaned the window frames, and rearranged the loose boards around the fireplace. As she knelt to brush away the old ashes, the tip of her fingernail touched a hollow space between two planks. The wood creaked, and then it lifted a loose floorboard. Beneath it, covered with a thick layer of dust, lay a dark leather-bound book, its edges frayed. Evelyn wiped it, and the dust obscured the light. Under the dirt, the cover was engraved with small letters S, Read, Ledger, Dust Creek Hollow. I still remember that moment. The narrator's voice echoed, low and slow. My hand was shaking, not because of fear, but because I knew I was about to touch something of his. She opened it. The paper was yellow, italicized, sturdy, the handwriting of someone who could write, but not beautifully. The first page was a list of simple things: crops, eggs, beans. The next page was marked born and gone, the births and deaths of children. Grace, June, 1872. Jacob, winter, 1876. Jacob, the deceased. Evelyn turned the pages more slowly. In the middle of the book, the writing was different. Evelyn Hart arrives June 3rd. She is to be treated kindly. She has nothing. We will give her all we have. The writing was slanted slightly, as if written in haste. The ink faded towards the end, possibly the last words before he fell. Evelyn sat still. The fire was still burning, but something inside her went out, then started up again, not pain, but a different kind of warmth understanding. Samuel Reed, a man she had never met, but who had written her name in the book as if she were part of the family. He had not only written, he had prepared for her presence, as if he believed that even if he were gone, a stranger would come and keep the house. It is not a will, she thought, but a trust. Light footsteps behind. Luke stood in the doorway, his hair disheveled, his eyes still hazy with sleep. He looked at the notebook, then at her. "You found it." She nodded. "Did you know it was here?" The boy scratched his head. Pa said, "If you came, I was to give it to you. But I didn't know where he kept it. He told you, if I came, yes, even if he was gone." Evelyn clutched the book tightly, feeling as if it were holding the man's last breath. The room was silent, except for the wind through the roof and the dying fire. Grace woke up, sat up, and asked, "What is it?" Luke answered for her. "It's Pa's writing." Evelyn opened the page again and read softly, as if reciting a prayer. The children listened quietly, not understanding everything, but knowing that when adults read slowly like that, it was important. Finally, she closed the book and put it on the table. I realized then. His voice dropped. He had seen me before I arrived. A man from the West, in the midst of failed harvests, still made room in his book for a strange woman. That is trust rarer than gold. She stood up and looked around the house. The patched walls, the leaking roof, the creaking floors, all bore the fingerprints of Samuel Reed. Everywhere there were traces of the one who had tried to keep everything intact until the end. Evelyn said softly, almost to herself, "It's not hope keeping me here. It's choice." Luke looked up, his eyes clear. "What's that mean?" She smiled, stroking his head. "It means I'm not waiting for anyone to come take me away." That afternoon, she placed the book on the mantelpiece. Beside it were Samuel's old hat and the wooden spoon Grace had used to stir the beans. She arranged them carefully, as if building a little altar not of mourning, but of gratitude. Outside, the wind blew harder. The fields were a dark yellow, dust flying. But in the little house, something had changed. A guest had ceased to be a guest. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Evelyn sat by the stove. Her hand traced the cover of the notebook, her eyes lingering on Samuel's last line. She did not know when he had written it, before or after the snake bite, or during his fever. But each stroke was steady, like the faith of someone who knew he was writing not for the present, but for what would come after he was gone. If one day I leave this place, she added at the bottom of the notebook, her handwriting shaky but sure, Evelyn Hart kept the fire as promised. She put down her pen, sighed, and smiled. I never met you. Samuel Reed. The narrator's voice was soft, almost a whisper. But I think you know. I kept my word. I stayed. Outside. The night was as thick as velvet. The wind rustling through the roof no longer sounded threatening. It was just the breath of the land, reminding that people were gone. But what they left behind, if written with faith, would never be lost. It had been raining since afternoon, first in small drops, then thick, then heavy as pebbles. The wind whipped the woodwork, whistled through the cracks in the roof, and blew ashes out of the hearth. Evelyn Hart blocked the windows with blankets, stacked the wood, and told the children to stay close to the hearth. Dust Creek summers still know how to be fickle like old enemies, quiet in the morning, ferocious at night. The children went to bed early, leaving only Luke to sit by the door, keeping watch. The rain drowned out all other sounds until, in the middle of the night, there was a knock on the door. Slow, heavy, not wind-like. Luke jerked, grabbing the rusty gun. Evelyn motioned for him to stay still, then stepped forward. 3 more knocks, clear, patient, like from someone familiar. She opened it a crack. The wind blew in, dragging with it a tall, thin, drenched figure with a heavy leather bag over his shoulder. Lightning flashed, illuminating a rough, unshaven face and eyes as deep as 2 dark holes. You must be Evelyn Hart. Her voice was hoarse, tired, but determined. She nodded, her hand still on the doorknob. Who are you, Daniel Reed, Samuel's brother? A gust of wind just then whipped across the roof, as if to confirm what he said. Evelyn stepped aside. Come in. You'll die out there. Daniel stepped in, dropping his leather satchel, water dripping from his shirt onto the floor. The firelight illuminated the tanned, wrinkled face of a man who had traveled far and had nowhere to return. Luke looked at him, his eyes filled with doubt. Daniel saw that and smiled tiredly. He looks like Sam. Then he fell silent, as if that sentence had consumed all his remaining strength. Evelyn handed him a dry towel, then poured warm water into a cup. You came a long way, from Redstone. Took me 3 days. He sat down near the fire and warmed his hands. After a moment, he opened his leather bag and took out another notebook, leather-bound like the one Evelyn had found, and a thick envelope wrapped in waterproofing oil. Sam told me to bring this, if you ever showed up. Han noi cham, moi tu nu fa vuot qua nui. We didn't part well, him and me. We argued over this land. I left before winter. Didn't even know he was dying. She was silent. In the firelight, Daniel looked down at the floor. His voice low, he said, There's a woman named Evelyn Hart. Said she's coming west. Said if he wasn't here, I was to see what she gets hers. Evelyn opened the letter. The paper was old and the ink was smudged, but it was still legible. If this finds you after I'm gone, Miss Hart, the house and the little ones are yours to keep. They need someone, and I have no one else to ask. Dust Creek ain't much, but it's all I have. I hope it's enough. Signed, Samuel Reed, the handwriting trembling like the last breath of a dying man. She read it twice, then folded it and placed her hand on the letter. Daniel Nin Nang, Matt Lang. Sam owed some men down in Redstone County, 2 of 'em, Briggs and Malloy. They lent him for feed and seed. He couldn't pay last winter. How much more than this land's worth? A clap of thunder boomed. In that moment, the children jumped, and little Abigail cried. Evelyn picked her up and patted her, her eyes never leaving Daniel. Han Noi Teep. They'll come. Once they know he's gone, they won't just want the land. The county might try to take the kids too, saying there's no rightful guardian. The air was thick. The flames tilted to one side, reflecting off Evelyn's face calm, but her eyes lit with a determination Daniel hadn't seen in anyone since Sam died. She spoke softly, almost in a whisper, but her voice did not tremble. I'll stay. This is my home now. The room was deathly quiet. Even the children seemed to understand that something important had just been said. Daniel looked at her for a long time, then nodded slowly, as if that would put his brother to rest. He stood up, walked over to the fireplace, opened his leather pouch again, and took out a small, rusty but sturdy key tied with a leather strap. Sam kept a box under the floorboard. Left it for you, I suppose. He said you'd know what to do. He handed her the key. Evelyn's hand closed around it, cold but steady. At that time, the voice was quiet and deep. I understood there are promises that do not need to be spoken, just someone delivering them. In the rain, in the storm, that is enough. Daniel stayed that night. He didn't say much. He sat by the door, looking out as if he still expected to see his brother coming back from the hills, with his old smile. The next morning, the rain stopped. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the window and onto the table where Samuel's letter lay open, beside the key. Evelyn folded the letters carefully into an old notebook and placed them both on the mantelpiece under her hat and her wooden spoon. Then she turned back and started the fire. Outside, the ground was wet, the sky clear, Dust Creek Hollow freshly washed, but inside her, something took shape. Not love, not duty, but the belief that this place had chosen her, as Samuel Reed had. I don't know if tomorrow someone will come to claim the land or take the children. The voice faded into the wind, but I know one thing for sure when that door opens. I will be standing there, no backing down. Winter came early that year, before the ground had time to freeze. The wind cut through the Dust Creek Valley like thin blades. The yellow grass burned, and the first snow mixed with the ashes from the stoves, covering the wooden roofs in gray. The children huddled around the stove, their breath billowing smoke. Even Evelyn Hart felt a chill in her chest, as if the cold were seeping from within. Though the doors were barred and the wind blocked with sacking, the cracks in the planks still squeaked like the breath of the struggling earth. On the second day of the cold, Jonas began coughing. Levi followed in the evening. Another day, Grace was feverish, her body burning with heat but her hands cold as ice. Evelyn had no medicine, only the old things Samuel Reed had left behind: a copper pot, a few bags of dried herbs, and the belief that warm water and a lullaby could bring a child back from the brink. She boiled water all night, the steam rising up, dampening the house, sticking to her hair and skin. The sound of boiling water, the children's heavy breathing, the wind howling outside all combined into the weary music of the first winter. Luke Reed kept his eyes on his sister. His eyes were sunken from lack of sleep. "She's burning. Miss Evelyn. She's burning bad." She placed her hand on Grace's forehead, feeling the heat burn her palm. "Get me more water." Her voice was calm, but her heart was pounding. All night long, she mixed water, steamed, sang lullabies, wiped foreheads, and changed wet towels. Even when she was exhausted, she still did not dare sit down. Her hands trembled with cold, but she still forced spoonfuls of porridge into the unconscious children's mouths. "I never thought I could be so weak," the narrator whispered, "and I never knew I could be so strong." On the third day, the fever spread to Abigail, the youngest. At first, there was only a faint cry. Then, silence. Evelyn picked her up, shook her gently, called softly, but the tiny body did not respond. On the other side, Grace collapsed on the floor while trying to pour water into the basin. Luke rushed to her aid, shouting, his voice breaking, "She's not breathing. She's not breathing." The house seemed to collapse with the sound. Evelyn knelt by the stove, holding both children, her mouth unable to form words to pray. Only a whisper to God or to the dead man. "I don't know. Don't take them. Take me." The wind outside howled as if it could hear it too. The fire in the hearth flickered, flared for a moment, then died down. Evelyn worked hard to rekindle the flames, adding more wood, including the last of the shed's planks. The night was longer than any other. The house was a lonely ship in a sea of snow. She sat there, Abigail in her arms, singing an old lullaby her mother had sung far away, when she was still illiterate. Her voice was hoarse, then silent. The next morning was different. The wind had died down. Snow had covered the windows. The house was so quiet you could hear a faint sob. Evelyn opened her eyes. Abigail stirred. Her lips were blue, but warming. Grace lay on the bed, sweating, breathing more evenly. I think I cried. The voice was as soft as mist, but maybe not. Maybe I was just laughing, and the tears came from the returning warmth. 3 days, 4 nights. When the fever finally broke, all 6 were alive. Evelyn was emaciated, her hands chapped, her lips dry. But something had changed in her eyes, no longer suffering. But knowing love doesn't come by magic. It comes by not walking away. Luke was the first to speak. When she brought the porridge, he took it, then divided his portion and gave it back to her. "You stayed." Just 2 words. But in them was everything she had ever wanted in her life to be seen by someone, and to believe that she belonged here. She didn't answer, just nodded slightly. Behind her, Grace smiled weakly, and the children chattered, asking for more food. The sound of spoons hitting bowls rang softly, like little bells. The house still looked old, the walls still cracked, the wind still seeped in. But the atmosphere inside was different. It was no longer Samuel Reed's house, but the home of Evelyn and the Reed children. As night fell, she sat before the fireplace, looking into the fire. The firelight reflected in her eyes, bright but soft. The outside door was tightly shut, and the snow was falling steadily. That night, the voice ended, as light as a breath. I realize there are things that don't need promises. Just stay, long enough for others to believe that you won't leave again. Then they will call you Mother, outside. The east wind was blowing again, but inside, Dust Creek Hollow, the fire still burned, flickering like the heartbeat of a newborn family. The news traveled slowly but surely. In Dust Creek, people didn't speak aloud, but whispered over fences, across waterfronts, and on horseback over muddy roads. There's a woman in the hollow, they said, married to the Reeds and her husband's dead. She's got 6 kids to take care of all by herself. No one remembers who spoke first, but one morning when the snow melted, Mrs. Ellsworth appeared on Evelyn Hart's doorstep. She was an old woman with white hair, a heavy basket on her shoulder, and her cheeks were rosy from the wind. She stood outside, hands on hips, voice hoarse as an iron cage. "Are you the Reed bride? People say you raised the children here without dying. I came to see if it is true." Evelyn just nodded, inviting her in. Mrs. Ellsworth put down the basket on the table and opened it. Flour, dried apples, a few onions, a small bag of salt. "I am old and can no longer feed anyone, but with this I don't have to eat beans all the time." Then she sat down heavily on the chair and sighed. "You are so skinny. You look like a child." After saying that, she muttered something else, like an old woman both pitying and scolding. My God, women in this region always choose suffering. Evelyn smiled, a rare smile. It made Mrs. Ellsworth look at her longer, then nod slightly. From that day on, the old woman came every 2 weeks, bringing something, sometimes just a story from the market, sometimes a burnt loaf of bread. I still remember the taste of her apple pie. The narrator's voice was a breath of memory, sweet but spicy on the back of my tongue, just like Western kindness, never smooth, but always warm enough. Then came Hank Doolin, the old blacksmith of Redstone. He came one damp afternoon, hammer and nails in hand. He didn't ask any questions, didn't say hello, just said, "I hear your door won't shut." He bent down, fixed the hinges, oiled the locks, and added new iron bolts. The hammering echoed steadily and solidly, echoing down the hillside. When he was done, he stood up, brushed his hands, and said, "Now, if anyone wants to come in, they'll have to call first." Evelyn tried to give him some money, but he shook his head. "Sam lent me a horse one winter. Now that's paid back." And so, one by one, from a distance, they began to walk toward the little house in the hollow. A young minister in Redstone, hearing of the story, sent over some books of Bible, and even an old collection of children's stories. In the letter, he wrote briefly, God has many ways of sending his hand. Sometimes it is the hand of a woman. The house that once only heard the wind now echoed with laughter, reading, coughing, the sound of burning wood, and even the sound of footsteps knocking on the door. Until one afternoon, a young girl appeared at the door, holding a newborn baby. Her hair was tangled, her face was purple from the cold. Her shirt was as thin as a shroud. Her name was Ruby Lane. She was only 16. Evelyn was tending the fire. She looked up and saw Ruby's eyes tired, empty, but still holding her child tightly. "I heard," Ruby said, her voice trembling. "They say you take in strays." Evelyn was silent for a moment, then replied, her voice low and light as a blanket placed on the shoulders of a lost person. "You're right on time." She pulled out a chair and sat Ruby by the fire. Luke brought the wood. Grace made porridge. No one asked where she came from or who the father was. In that house, you didn't need a reason to stay. From that day on, Ruby became a part of Dust Creek Hollow, too. She watched Abigail while Evelyn worked and sang lullabies at night, her voice soft and warm. One day, Hank Doolin passed by and heard the singing. He paused, took off his hat, and continued on, muttering like her mother. The town began to call the house by a new name, the Reed Hearth. Whoever needed a place to sleep stopped there. Whoever was lonely went there. Whoever was hungry went there. No one asked who Evelyn was. No one mentioned the failed marriage. No one said the real mother was dead, because there are roles that, if you live up to them long enough, the world will name them by their proper names. At that moment, the narrator's voice dropped. I understood it's not kindness that brings people together, but persistence, like a fire in the kitchen, not blazing fiercely, just burning just enough, night after night, and everyone who passes by wants to stay a while. One evening in early spring, Mrs. Ellsworth came again, carrying a basket of fresh-baked bread. She sat by the stove, watching the children chattering around the table, then turned to Evelyn. "You've done it. I thought you could only last half a season." Evelyn smiled and replied, "I thought so too." The old woman chuckled, the firelight reflecting off her wrinkled face like an old map of the West. "Now this hollow has a heart." Outside, the spring wind blew across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of apple smoke and baking powder. The little house in Dust Creek Hollow, once a place of mourning and snow, was now a place where people returned not because it was big, but because it had an unquenchable fire. Spring had not yet bloomed when the dust of the road had already covered Dust Creek Valley in gold. That afternoon, Evelyn Hart was sweeping the yard, the children drying blankets on the porch, when two figures on horseback emerged from the dirt road to the south. Black horses, long coats, polished leather shoes. They looked so different from the people of this area, too clean, too cold. Luke Reed saw it first. He straightened up, squinting strangers. Evelyn wiped her hands and watched. Dust trailed behind them, an ominous sign. Two men rode up and stopped on the porch. The taller one bowed dryly, his voice dry. "Ma'am, Carter Briggs, Redstone County Office." The other continued, "Owen Malloy." "Deputy." Briggs pulled a red-stringed notepad from his pocket and placed it on the wooden table on the porch. "We've come about the Reed property." Evelyn looked down at the pile of papers. The red seal stood out like blood in the sunlight. "What about it?" Briggs curled his lips slightly, his voice as stiff as an indictment. "Samuel Reed died intestate, no recorded will. No legal spouse. This land is in arrears. The children have no registered guardian. By law, they're wards of the county. Each sentence was like a stone thrown into the water." Inside the house, Grace's voice was muffled. Levi and Jonas clutched each other's shirts. Luke stood in the doorway, his eyes dark, his hand on the rusty pistol hanging on the wall. Evelyn was silent for a long time. Then she said softly, slowly, as if measuring each word, "Briggs, there are laws older than yours. Briggs, call May. I'm not here to argue morals, ma'am, just the law." The air was thick. Grace stepped out from behind the curtain, holding little Abigail so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her voice was small but clear. She stayed when she could have run. That makes her ours. The words fell, as light as a breath, but enough to make Malloy pause. Briggs, on the other hand, spoke even more sternly. "Children don't decide these things. The court does." Luke lifted the old gun from the wall and held it in his hand, not raising it, just holding it a childish yet decisive gesture. "We're not leaving. Briggs lich qua Malloy, roa ke la Evelyn. Ma'am, We'll come back with the sheriff if we have to." Evelyn did not reply. She opened a drawer and took out Samuel's leather notebook and the yellowed letter. She placed them on the table next to the pile of papers with the red seal. "You see that his words are law in this house." She read slowly, clearly, each word, her voice not trembling. "If she comes after I'm gone, the house and the little ones are hers to keep. They need someone, and I have no one else to ask." Briggs did not read it, but glanced at it. Sentiment doesn't change deed. "Mrs. Hart, is it?" Evelyn replied, softly and firmly as dry-wood heart read. Malloy bowed his head, avoiding her gaze. Perhaps he had a mother, had heard some lullaby interrupted by poverty. "But the rules are the rules," he repeated, as if to gain more confidence. "Will return in 3 days. With proper authority." They turned their horses. Dust rose again, obscuring their vision. Only the smell of ash and the sound of a child's heart pounding in the little wooden house remained. Evelyn stepped in, placing her hand on Luke's shoulder. "Put it down." She did so, but her eyes were still on the field, where the dust had not yet settled. In the house, everyone knew what was coming. No one spoke, but the silence took the form of a familiar fear, the fear of being robbed of what we had just learned to call home. That night, no one slept. Evelyn sat before the fireplace, watching the fire die down, its light shining on the cracked wall. In the darkness, she whispered, "If the law can't see love, then maybe love will have to stand in front of it." I remember that night. The old man's voice echoed, slow as smoke. She sat there, small but strong. No husband, no papers, but a faith that silenced the valley. The next morning, Mrs. Ellsworth was the first to know what had happened. She did not ask many questions, but said, "If they come, do not open the door alone." Then Hank Doolin brought more iron and bolts. Ruby Lane hung a white sheet on her porch, a sign of a house in need, and so, one by one, people around the neighborhood began quietly preparing, not because of the law, but because of something else, the fire they had seen burning all winter. Out there, where the dust had not yet settled, Briggs might be making notes in his notebook, or half smiling at the thought of justice. But in Dust Creek Hollow, something else was growing, something not written in any law, the loyalty of those who believed in kindness. When Mr. Briggs returned, the narrator paused a beat, then softened. The whole valley was waiting. No paper is strong enough to extinguish what is kindled by love. Outside, the wind blew, scattering the ashes from the hearth, but inside the little cabin the fire burned, yellow and steady. A woman sat there, her back straight, her hand resting on an old notebook as if on her heart. And that night, everyone in Dust Creek Hollow knew the law of paper was about to clash with the law of man. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold still clung to the wooden walls. That night, the fire burned low in the hearth, its light dancing across tired but peaceful faces. They sat around the rough table, the one Samuel Reed had built himself. It bore the marks of time now, chipped corners, cracked top, but still held firm, as if it knew its job was to hold these people together, steaming from the pot over the fire. The stew smelled of bacon, carrots, and onions, a luxury the children of this region had never had. Evelyn ladled it into bowls, her hands shaken slightly with fatigue, but her lips smiling. Outside, the wind blew through the valley, carrying with it the sounds of the sleeping land, the rustle of trees, the distant hoot of owls. No one spoke for a moment, only the sound of spoons clinking against bowls. Levi took 3 quick sips, eyes closed as if dreaming. Grace sat up straight, adjusting baby Abigail's dress, and sang softly a tune she'd learned from Evelyn as she ate. Thomas and Jonas competed to see who could eat faster, then giggled, dropping their spoons. Evelyn looked at them, feeling the fire in the hearth burn within her. It had been a long time since the house had felt alive. I still remember the light that night. The narrator's voice was low, as if looking through a memory. The light not only from the fire, but from the faces around the table. It was the kind of light that only those who have lost everything can appreciate. Luke Reed, 10 years old, the most stubborn and quiet of the boys, was the first to break the silence. He looked up, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight, and said slowly, firmly, without looking at anyone, "Mama." The room suddenly fell silent. The wind outside the porch seemed to have stopped, leaving only the sound of the 6 children's heartbeats. Evelyn raised her head slightly, as if unsure of her hearing. Grace looked at her brother, then at Evelyn, her mouth moving, her voice so low it was barely audible, "Mama," then Thomas, Levi, Jonas. Each one followed, repeating the soft sound like a prayer. The whole house rang with the word "Mama," each one saying it in his own way, trembling, innocent, serious as if calling upon something more sacred than God. Abigail was speechless, only smiling, holding out her hand to Evelyn. She sat there, unable to speak. Her lip trembled, and tears fell, but lightly, not heavily, not tears of pity, but of relief, as if all the long journeys, all the snowstorms, all the loneliness had a reason to exist. Luke bowed his head, thinking he had said the wrong thing, but Evelyn reached out and touched his shoulder, her voice small, trembling but firm. "Then I'll be that for you. Every day I'm given breath. There's nothing else to say." It was the moment. The narrator spoke slowly, as if afraid to shatter the memory, when a woman who had given birth to no child was born again, to a mother. After that, no one mentioned it again, no one defined it. But from that day on, the children no longer called her Miss Evelyn. The name Mama just stayed, as natural as breathing, as the sound of the door closing every night, as the never-ending good-night wish. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Evelyn sat before the fireplace. The fire burned low, the candles burned out, and the smoke drifted straight up to the roof. Overhead, the wind whistled through the boards that Hank Doolin had repaired. She looked around. The house was still old, but now it had a soul. There were childish handprints on the walls, Ruby's towel drying on a chair, and the steady breathing of 6 dreaming creatures. Evelyn placed her hand on her chest, feeling her heartbeat match the fire. "Mama," she whispered, trying to call herself, and smiled. In this land, names are something people reclaim from silence. No one grants them. No one witnesses them. Just repeated actions until the world acknowledges them. And now, Evelyn Hart Reed has a real name, not on paper, but in the hearts of 6 children. Perhaps the people of Dust Creek still say. The last voice echoed like the evening smoke that, in the winter of that year, a lonely woman came here looking for her husband, and found herself. And when the first child called her one little word, the whole valley knew the Reeds had returned. Outside, the wind had cooled. In the sky, the snow had melted into mist, reflecting the pale moonlight. The small house in Dust Creek Hollow, where once there had been only the sound of wind and loss, was now warmed by a single word. One word was enough to hold them together for a lifetime. Mama. Winter melted like the last breath of a long dream. The ice on Dust Creek cracked and cracked, flowing south on the hills. The snow melted to reveal soft black soil, the soil that Samuel Reed had once said to his brother, "One day, this will feed us." Now, those words were in the hands of a woman he had never met. Evelyn Hart Reed stood on the porch, her faded woolen scarf blowing in the wind. In the yard, the children were digging up the patch of earth in the east corner where Samuel had driven the wooden stake. No one told them, but everyone knew that was where the garden began. Luke Reed, the stubborn boy from the past, was taller than last season. He learned how to hold a hammer, how to measure a plank of wood, how to not be afraid of making mistakes. In the morning, he followed Hank Doolin, the old blacksmith at Redston, to learn how to fix hinges and hammer iron. In the afternoon, he climbed the roof and replaced rotten planks. The hammering echoed steadily and rhythmically, no longer the sound of survival, but of someone rebuilding something stronger. Grace was in charge of the kitchen. The 8-year-old girl, without waiting for anyone to show her, decided to make cornbread one afternoon. When Evelyn walked in, the smoke was thick. The smell of burning permeated every corner of the wall. Thomas and Jonas covered their mouths and laughed. Levi ran around shouting, "Fire, fire!" Grace blushed, her eyes brimming with tears. Evelyn did not scold her. She just bent down, took a ladle and stirred the unburned dough, then said softly, "It can still be saved, dear." The children would repeat that sentence later, whenever they encountered difficulties. It can still be saved. I think that was the philosophy of the whole house. The voice was husky and warm. People didn't throw away anything broken. They patched it. They mended it. They learned how to make it live a little longer, just like themselves. Ruby Lane was different. The 16-year-old girl who had once carried her baby to the door like a fugitive had now regained her pink color, and her shoulders were no longer hunched. The baby, named Maggie, crawled around the kitchen and was loved by all. One day, Ruby sang, not sadly, not tremblingly, a country song about a woman waiting for her husband by the Missouri River. Evelyn listened, put her hand on her shoulder and whispered, "You're living now." Ruby, not hiding. That made Ruby cry, then laugh, her first real laugh since arriving in Dust Creek. In those days, the house was no longer a shelter from storms. It was a nest, a place where people rebuilt from the ashes. Grace planted the first seeds purple beans Mrs. Ellsworth had brought. Jonas and Levi made scarecrows so silly they kept the family laughing. Luke hammered a new door, wrote his name on the wood not to mark ownership, but to remind them he had been there and hadn't left. Evelyn, every evening, sat down to write in Samuel's old notebook. The new page began with small, even handwriting, spring, year of our Lord, 1882. The Reed family planted again. I once asked her, the narrator interjected, like someone who had sat on the porch, why she kept writing the Reed family when her name was Reed too. She laughed and said, "Because I'm still learning to know it, day by day." In the afternoons, warm sunlight streamed through Dust Creek Hollow, illuminating the cracks in the wooden walls. The family ate on the porch, plates of corn on the cob, bowls of bean stew, laughter ringing out. Grace still burned the pot a few times, but each time everyone ate it all a small rite of passage. Sometimes Daniel Reed Samuel's younger brother would return, bringing a few things from town: new nails, a piece of cloth, sometimes just a packet of salt. Daniel would teach Luke how to check the roof, then quietly leave, like someone who knew where he belonged was no longer there. Before leaving, he would say to Evelyn, "Sam used to say this valley needed a woman's hands." I think he was right. Evelyn, she job. He was right about many things, day after day. Dust Creek came back to life. The bean plants grew tall, and tiny purple flowers bloomed here and there. When visitors came, the children ran out to greet them. People came not to pity them anymore, but to learn how to survive, how to grow, how to love unconditionally. One quiet afternoon, as the sunset turned the valley to copper, Evelyn stood on the porch, looking into the distance, toward Wolf Ridge, where the horizon was hazy with smoke, a thin, straight column of smoke, strange, not the smoke of a stove, nor of burning copper. Luke saw it too. He put his hand on the hilt of his hammer, saying nothing. Evelyn was silent, the wind in her hair smelling of earth and danger. The column of smoke reminded them that peace in the West was always limited. But that night they ate dinner on the porch. The narrator concluded slowly, firmly, because you can't live in fear forever. Evelyn poured more broth, divided it evenly, and looked around the table and saw no more orphans, but a family. And I think, in that look, she saw her first summer. The Reed hearth house still stands there, in the middle of Dust Creek Valley. Rustic, small, but a symbol of the simplest thing humans need, not just to survive, but to live together. That morning, the wind blew from Wolf Ridge, carrying the unfamiliar chill of early spring. 2 horses came along the dirt road leading into Dust Creek hollow black coats, wide hats, and shiny boots. Evelyn Hart Reed knew without being told they were back. Carter Briggs and Owen Malloy, this time bearing not just paper, but a scarlet-sealed order from the Redstone County Courthouse. They came slowly, purposefully, as if they knew victory was at hand. It is said, the voice rang out, low and distant, that on that day the road into the hollow was deathly silent, as if the whole land were holding its breath. The children were gathering firewood in the yard. When Luke saw the horse, he ran into the house. Grace stood in the doorway, eyes wide, holding Abigail tightly in her arms. No one cried. No one ran. They just watched, silently but firmly. Briggs dismounted, brushed his coat, and looked around as if inspecting his own property. His voice was steady and cold. By order of Judge Waverly, this land and all miners upon it are now under the custody of Redstone County. Evelyn stepped out from the porch, wearing a simple brown dress, her hair tied back, and carrying a Samuel Reed ledger. Behind her stood Luke, Grace, Thomas, Levi, Jonas, and Abigail, all lined up in a row. No one speaking, but their eyes saying, "This is our home." Evelyn placed the ledger on the wooden table on the porch, along with the letter found in the safe, and the iron key that Daniel Reed had given her. She spoke slowly, her voice not trembling. "You've come for paper. I have paper too." Briggs raised his eyebrows. Malloy was silent. Evelyn opened the notebook, turned to the last page, and pointed to the faded words, "If she arrives after I'm gone, she will keep this home, and they will be hers to care for." Briggs smiled faintly. "That isn't a will, that's sentiment," Evelyn replied, her eyes never leaving him, and yet That sentiment is what built every inch of this land. From the stable behind, Daniel Reed stepped out. He carried his brother's old shotgun. Standing straight on the steps, his voice was hoarse and firm. You heard the lady. The sound of a cocked gun was short and dry, but it made Malloy tighten his grip on the reins. Briggs glanced around, about to say something, but then he noticed there were figures slowly appearing around the house. Mrs. Ellsworth led the way, her silver hair flying in the wind, her broomstick in her hand, but her posture like a baton. Hank Doolan followed, his blacksmith's coat still dusty, carrying an iron hammer. In the distance, Ruby Lane, holding her baby, and a few ranch hands from the valley below, stood in a silent line. No one shouted, no one threatened. They just stood there, a human wall, strong and silent, behind Evelyn. The wind rose, scattering the papers Briggs held. One flew into the mud, the ink smeared and meaningless. Briggs bent down to pick it up, then looked up, meeting Evelyn's eyes in those eyes. There was no hate, only a strange confidence. They say, the voice mingled with the wind. He bowed his head slowly, as if realizing that there are things the law cannot touch. Malloy touched Briggs's shoulder and whispered, "Let's go." Not today. The two men turned their horses. No one stopped them. There was only the sound of the wind whistling through the meadow and the sound of hooves fading toward Redstone. Evelyn stood there for a long time, watching, then bent down and picked up the fallen paper, still covered with mud. She folded it and threw it into the fire in the fireplace. The flames quickly swallowed it, red and bright, the ashes flying up into the wind. Grace approached and asked softly, "Mama, are they gone for good?" Evelyn replied, "Maybe not, but it doesn't matter." She looked around, at each face, each person who had stepped forward for her. Then she said softly, as if to herself, as if making a silent prayer, not by law, not by blood, but by choice, and choice will always win. Mrs. Ellsworth smacked her lips and whispered to Hank, "I told you so. This house has a heart." The group dispersed, leaving Evelyn and the children in the late afternoon light. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the roof Luke had just repaired. Chickens ran around the yard, and children's laughter rang out again. Not the sound of victory, but the sound of a home saved. They say, the old man's voice concluded, that was the day Dust Creek Hollow became more than a place where people lived. It became a place where they chose to stay. And from that day on, everyone who passed through the valley knew if there's anything stronger than blood, it's choice. Evelyn sat on the porch in a wooden chair, the wind in her hair, the sky fading to copper. The children sat around her, Ruby rocking the baby, Daniel sharpening an old knife, Mrs. Ellsworth lighting a fire. The smell of cornbread filled the air. Evelyn gently opened the notebook Samuel left behind and wrote another line. Today. The family stood together, not by blood, but by choice. Then she folded it, placing it beside her heart. The sunset fell through the bars of the window, painting the house honey-colored. For the first time, Evelyn felt that peace was no longer a foreign thing. It was right here, among the people she had chosen, and who had chosen her. Spring came to Dust Creek Hollow as promised. The snow melted away, revealing damp earth and the scent of fresh grass. On the reed hearth roof, new shingles gleamed in the morning sun. Nails hammered evenly signs of a peaceful labor season. Wind blew through Grace's new curtains. their patterns clumsy but bright. On the porch, Luke's pine swing was complete. It creaked softly in the wind, a pleasant sound, like the breathing of a house truly alive. I still remember that spring. The old voice spoke slowly. The year the house on Dust Creek was no longer a refuge for the lost, but the heart of the valley. That lunchtime. Reed Hearth threw open the door. People from the neighborhood came bearing small but precious gifts, Mrs. Ellsworth brought baked apples. Hank Doolin carried an old anvil to Luke to forge the future, and Ruby Lane held her baby, smiling brightly, her once tangled hair now smooth. The children ran around the yard, laughing loudly, chasing chickens and puppies Hank had brought them. On the long table, Evelyn spread stew, cornbread, and the jar of honey Mrs. Ellsworth had given her. No one prayed aloud, but gratitude was in their eyes, in the way they shared each small portion. Each had known hunger, had touched despair, and they were grateful for each meal, each season of peace. Luke showed off his newly repaired barn. Grace shyly accepted the compliment of being called Little Cook of the Hollow. Thomas, Levi, and Jonas set up camp by the stream. Ruby sat sewing a shirt for Maggie, and Daniel, quiet as ever, sharpened the plow, the steady tapping of the metal like the heartbeat of the earth. The house no longer trembles in the wind. It stands firm, like the people who built it with their hands, with faith, with love. The afternoon sun spread a golden light across the fields. Evelyn entered the room and took out Samuel Reed's ledger, the thing that had started it all, and the last thing he had left. The paper was discolored, but the handwriting she had added was new, soft, steady. Evelyn Hart Reed, head of household by heart, if not by law. She paused long on that line, then smiled. All her journeys from the spring train, from the distant Ash Hollow depot to the wind-rotten house had led here. No wedding, no vows, just a choice repeated every day to stay, to cook, to heal, to love. Evelyn closed the notebook and wrote a small line at the bottom, as if for someone to find it years later. If you're lost, hungry, or alone, come in. We've been waiting for you. Then she put the book back in the drawer beside the safe key and one of Grace's old ribbons. The sunset light fell on the page, making the words glow like a small flame that never went out. Someone says. The narrator's voice dropped like a whisper of wind through a field. Every good house has an unwritten greeting, and at Reed Hearth it is in the smell of cornbread, in the fire that burns every night. Evelyn stepped out onto the porch. The swing creaked like an old friend. Before her was Dust Creek Valley green now, with the sound of a babbling brook and returning birds. She looked further, toward Cedar Ridge Station, where the train had stopped years ago, where she, the poor woman from the east, had gotten off to look for a husband. It turned out that the husband was just an excuse. Fate did not bring her to Samuel Reed, but to children who needed a mother and a land that needed a heart to stay. Grace ran out, her hair disheveled, and asked Mama, "What are you looking at?" Evelyn turned back, her smile as light as the spring breeze, just where it all began. Inside the house. Luke laughed, Ruby sang a lullaby, and Daniel added more firewood. Smoke from the stove rose into the sky, mingling with the clouds. I stood outside the fence, looking at them. The final voice trembled slightly, and understood that, if there is anything more lasting than blood, it is chosen love. They do not need family, do not need papers, only trust. and sometimes it is that choice that makes God smile. The dusk fell, reflecting a golden light on the cabin windows. Evelyn sat on the swing, her arms swaying slowly, her eyes closed, amidst the laughter of the children and the rustle of the wind. A story was ending, not with a full stop, but with warmth. The house in Dust Creek Hollow was still there. Many years later, centuries later, when people called the place by many different names, but on the old door one could still see the knife-cut words, faded with time, but never gone. Chosen love outlives blood. And so, as in many springs past, Reed Hearth remained open. Sometimes, on cold nights, they said you could still see the yellow light on the porch and the shadow of a woman sitting and swinging on a swing, looking into the distance where the first train had stopped, taking her with it, and given Dust Creek something the frontier had never had: a real home. Evelyn Hart Reed. A story makes us realize something simple yet profound. In this life, it's not those who are born with us that are family, but those who choose to stay when we are weakest and most lost. In that windy and lonely frontier, Evelyn had no name, no husband, no property, but she had a choice to light a fire instead of leaving, to love instead of resenting, and to rebuild a home instead of letting it collapse. That love, not noisy, not romantic, was the most enduring kind of love, a love chosen, not given. In today's life, sometimes we also get lost in our own borders: loss, loneliness, disappointment. But if we stop, open our hearts, and choose to be kind to someone, we may be building our own Dust Creek. Because as Evelyn once wrote, if you are lost, hungry, or just need a place to stay, come in. We are waiting for you. Thank you for joining this story. If you believe that kindness can save the world, one roof at a time, please like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel to continue our journey of healing between the land of wind and light.